Good morning. This is April 29th, I believe. The date is always relevant because with fast-moving events, you need to know what I could have known about events that may take place between the time I record this and the time you listen or watch to it. Anyway, we are still in the midst in the Middle East of negotiations with Hamas. Will they release the hostages, this, that, and the other thing? But I want to move a little bit forward because sooner or later, the question arises, what about the Hamas? What about Gaza? What about the Palestinians in general? And while we know that, the Hamas representing, I guess, themselves and a fair number of Gazans did horrendous things in Israel and also still have hostages while I'm recording this, we need to kind of imagine what is going to happen once the hostages are released and then there's a ceasefire. So let me sort of start with a little bit with Adam and Eve on this. The idea of creating the state of Israel is attached to the Balfour Declaration, which was a declaration the English made in 1917, which said that the state of Israel, or rather a national home for the Jewish people, should be established in Palestine. And then, if I might just quote, it's added, nothing should be done which in any way prejudices the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. So then as we also know, at the end of World War II, 1947-48, the state of Israel was created, but the state of Palestine was not. And ever since then, there have been discussions and conflict over the creation of a Palestinian state or what to do with the Palestinians. Now, who are the Palestinians? I mean, we sort of listen to the news and we say, well, of course we know who the Palestinians are. Well, scholars consider them an community, ethnocultural community. That is to say, a group of people who identify as being an ethnic group, so to speak. And we also know that the Palestinians, unlike many other groups in the world, do not have a state to call their own. That's obvious, but the Palestinians aren't the only folks who've been running around and at various times having conflict and difficulties, who also say we're an ethnic group, we have connections with each other, cultural, historical, but unlike many people in the world, we don't have a state, or we're not part of a state that we are either willing or at least forced to be part of. Who might these other folks be? For example, the Kurds, and for a long period of time, and still to somewhat historically correct, the Armenians and so forth. So there are groups of people that have run around the world which are either divided among states, living inside states that they don't want to be part of, and so forth. So while the Palestinians have been, the focus of much warfare, violence, and attention, they're not the only group, because starting some centuries back, the idea arose that there should be something called nation states. States being a political definition of a territory with a government that has a capacity to govern and can make its foreign policy, but even more importantly, is recognized by other states. Some states are multinational, some states are uninational, but in any event, the Palestinians are very clear that they don't have a state, and they have been waiting, I suppose, since 1917 at least, for a state. Now, when the United Nations recognized Israel, it sort of did not recognize a Palestinian state, though that's always been discussed. And the Palestinians, or at least more or less, you can argue, and I don't want to get into the nitty-gritty here, the Palestinians have had sort of an informal seat at the United Nations without having full membership. So they have a representative who can sit on things, and that's only been true in recent history. So that's where we are. Then what about what kind of people are we talking about and how many? The state of Israel has, don't hold me to these figures because they're not all necessarily from the same year, but you will get the general drift, Israel has a total population of about 9.8 million people, of which 20% are Palestinians. Now, the Israelis call them not Palestinians, generally speaking, but Israeli Arabs, but that's what they are. And then, of course, the Palestinians are strewn between Gaza, which has about 2.5 million people, and the West Bank, where the Palestinians are about 51% and Jews are about 41% now. But those are not the only places. I mean, there are about 1 million Palestinians living in Syria, for example. There are, I'm just looking at a paper, so I have semi-accurate statistics here. There are about 1 million Palestinians living in Syria. I just said that. There are about 1 million Palestinians living in Saudi Arabia. And surprised, there are even 500,000 Palestinians living in the South American country of Chile. So there's a big diaspora of Palestinians, some of which, of course, are nationals and citizens and even born in other countries. We have heard recently about, the upset not just of Arab population or in Detroit and other areas, but some of those folks are Palestinians. They're not all Palestinians. Now, the Palestinians are Arabs. And why are they Arabs? Because they speak Arabic. They're also largely Muslims. About 80% or so of Palestinians are Muslims. They're Sunni Muslims. And about the rest of them are Christians and other things. So there are Palestinians who are not Muslims, right? But all Palestinians, more or less, at least originally, were linked to the Arabic language. Now, you recall we've talked about the Middle East before. For example, Iran is a Muslim country, a Sunni Muslim country, but they're not Arabs. Why? Because they don't speak Arabic, right? So the designation of Arabs means speaking Arabic speakers. So the Palestinians are strewn about, but the concern is, why don't they have a Palestinian state? And their desire to have a Palestinian state. And wars have been fought. I don't want to recall the whole history of Gaza. Gaza was then sort of semi-self-governing. Then there is the West Bank, which has a political structure, the PLO, which is not functioning very well. So there's a lot to say about this complexity. But then the question for us is, what about the future? And so the idea is that when the conflict in Gaza comes to a halt somehow, Israel says Hamas will be destroyed. I think hardly any observers think that that's going to be the case. Some of the leadership of Hamas may be destroyed. And some of the leadership, by the way, is not inside Gaza at all. They're in Qatar and other places. So it's not even that killing the leadership of Hamas in Gaza would decapitate the leadership of Hamas, there's leadership outside of Hamas, of Gaza. And I think no observers really believe that a unitary state is possible. That is to say, that the people in the West Bank and in Gaza will get absorbed in a larger Israeli state, which will then, be not only a Jewish state, but it will, of course, be heavily Palestinian or of Arab origin. So that doesn't seem like anybody thinks that that's going to happen. So then the discussion is what happens when some kind of halt comes to the current Gaza situation, and everybody in the world more or less thinks there'll have to be a two-state solution, because otherwise, what's the sense of trying to rebuild Gaza a few years down the road? You're going to have another conflict, etc. Israel, the current government of Israel, says absolutely not. We're not having a two-state solution, and we are going to increasingly go back into controlling Gaza and increasingly put more and more Israelis and Jewish settlers into West Bank and more or less control those situations. That's the only thing we in the state of Israel can do. Many people in Israel and many people outside of Israel believe that this kind of take is foolhardy because, it is the policy over and over again of Netanyahu to say there will be no two-state solution. And more or less everybody in the Middle East and almost all countries in the world are saying, yes, there has to be a two-state solution. Well, given the mess in Gaza, 65-70% of all of Gaza buildings are either destroyed or badly damaged. 38 to 40,000 Gazans have been killed. The number of Gazans that are maimed, lost limbs, etc., is huge. The starvation in Gaza will have produced, by the time this somehow stabilizes, a generation of children who will suffer both physical and mental damage due to the food deprivation. How do we know this? We know this from other parts of the world, where Ethiopia, let's say, or Somalia, Sudan, where over the years populations have starved, not just because of warfare, very often also about climate change and lack of food and so forth. The causes are complex, but one knows, and the World Health Organization knows, as well as Doctors Without Borders, that children who have been food deprived for a substantial period of time do not grow either physically or mentally normally. And that is going to be a disaster down the line. But in any event, what you have in Gaza now has been a situation where, of course, the population of Gaza, even when it was not, even the large chunk of Gazan population that were not Hamas members at all, turned in support of Hamas because they were fighting the bombings and so forth of the state of Israel. Recent reports, and there have been some surveys, have indicated that a fair chunk of the Gazan population is now blaming Hamas for the disaster that has befallen them. So the popularity or the support of Hamas by the Palestinians is not so clear anymore. And that produces opportunity for eventually developing a state in which Hamas may play a role, but not necessarily the dominant political role in any two-state solution. So that has actually changed a lot in the last month and is of some interest. But then you get to the fact that neither Hamas nor anybody else would be in a position to run Gaza and to deal with the conflict ongoing conflicts in the West Bank. So exactly what are you going to do? Well, from the perspective of Israel, Israel will run these places. From this perspective of the world and the future peace in the area, and actually in terms of actually Israeli interests, which many people in Israel see, although the current government doesn't see, it would behoove the Israel to say a process needs to be put into place, not a never-ending process, for stabilizing and rebuilding Gaza and battening down the conflict and the violence in the lack of political management in the West Bank. So how could this be done, or how should this be done? Increasingly, international actors, people who are involved directly and indirectly, from Egypt to European countries to the United States, are talking about developing an international transitional government, or at least rule, in Gaza that allows for the rebuilding, both physically, mentally, and politically, the state of Gaza and do it as a transition, not a transition of Israel going back and ruling Gaza, but rather an international supervised transition, which down the line will promise an independent Palestinian state of some kind, or at least working towards an independent Palestinian state, which the Israelis are not the central part of. That's a serious discussion right now, and it's worth seriously discussing, because Israel has an interest in continuing the sort of peace it was making with its Arab neighbors. And so, in some senses, a post-Netanyahu government may be persuaded that making some kind of peace and alliance with Saudi Arabia, the largest, most powerful, and economic, most viable Sunni country, as distinct from Shiite countries aligned with Iran, that would be a kind of incentive for Israel to say, look, we're living in this region. We want to have good economic and political relations with at least the Sunni countries in this part of the world. And in order to do so, we have to give in to have Gaza being managed and run transitionally in the participation of both Arab and non-Arab countries in the world. The question also arises, of course, who is going to rebuild Gaza? Unless all the remaining Gazans are going to move somewhere else, which is an unlikely situation, then, the Gazans will need help and alliances. And any kind of at least transitional management of Gaza will benefit from having a temporary caretaker management on the one hand, and on the other hand, also it would be a bargaining chip for the Gazans to have the economic input of Saudi Arabia, which will be badly needed to try to rebuild Gaza. So the rebuilding of Gaza is a monumentally expensive situation. And so there are diplomatic leverage points for the Gazans, for the Israelis, and for everybody else in the region. So diplomacy here, really, as well as carrots of economic transfers to help rebuild Gaza, as well as carrots that seem realistic of eventually developing a two-state solution, of which Israel is not a party and is not controlling, is how people in general around who are trying to figure out the future are looking at the world. Now, the Palestinians who are, in various parts of the world, some of them are refugees, some of them simply are Palestinians who are now nationals of various countries who have no particular interest in moving back to the West Bank or to Gaza. But they do have a philosophic, emotional interest in what is happening to the Palestinians, right? It's just like Armenians in Fresno have always taken an interest as to what's happening to Armenians around the world. And the treatment of Armenians, and ditto the Kurds, right? The Kurds in Iran and the Kurds in Iraq and so forth. People identify across these ethnic and in some cases linguistic lines. Now, in the case of Palestinians, of course, no matter where they live, their native language is Arabic, although, if they live in Chile, they might have learned Spanish, or if they live in the US, English. And Arabic may be a second language, and 2 or 3 generations down, they may not even be Arab speakers anymore, just like any other immigrants. So what am I talking about? I am talking about what happens if there is a ceasefire, what happens if the remaining hostages, however many are still alive, gets returned, what happens and should happen with respect to Israeli policy once Netanyahu government is replaced by a more sensible Israeli government, and what happens when international actors, both in the Middle East and internationally, weigh in very heavily in terms of finding some kind of transition. Now you may ask, bottom line, should Hamas be part of the transition? Well, the current leadership of Hamas, probably not. But on the other hand, Hamas is a fairly viable and large institution. And rather than, putting them in the corner or trying to forget about them or trying to, cut them out entirely, it may very well be necessary to include Hamas in any future development of Gaza and the Palestinian future. So I myself don't see Hamas going away. Hamas, the current leadership, and it as a terrorist organization may go away, but Hamas per se may not be. Let me use the last minute or two, though, talking about the West Bank. 51%, roughly speaking, of the West Bank are now Palestinians. 41% are now Israelis. Israel is trying to take over more and more of the West Bank. The settlers are increasing. And going back a few weeks or months, you might have read about the degree to which the Palestinians in the West Bank have been imprisoned in Israel. Israel has about 9,000 or so Palestinian prisoners in its prisons. Some of them are, in fact, convicted criminals who themselves were terrorists. But quite a lot of the people in Israeli prisons, Palestinians in Israeli prisons, have had very minor offenses and very often have not even been convicted of anything. And particularly tragic for the West Bank is that around 800 or so children are still in Israeli prisons, and they're getting arrested as we speak. Most of them, the only thing they've done is throw stones at soldiers or whatever. They haven't been tried. They're under quote unquote protective custody. The circumstances that they are in these facilities and prisons are really quite awful, reports indicate. And the reason, I could offer many more details, but the reason I'm laying this out is that the treatment of Israel, of the Palestinian population in the West Bank has been such that many of them in recent months have thrown their weight in the direction of Hamas. West Bank folks were not by and large party of Hamas. They didn't even necessarily approve of Hamas. But given what has happened to the Gazans, many of them now in surveys and so forth have favorable opinions about Hamas. That too needs to be addressed. And that too, I think the way to address it is to find a reasonable international solution to the Gazan situation, but also to be serious internationally and find an Israeli government that can be serious about a two-state solution, which would, of course, include the West Bank. So the apple cart has been overthrown. Apples are rolling everywhere. The situation psychologically and politically for Palestinians has gotten worse and worse. It is almost impossible to put the genie back in the bottle. And it will take a lot of incentives, not just from Western countries in the United States, but a lot of incentives from Muslim countries, whether it's Saudi Arabia or it's, Qatar or any other states, to say, look, we have an interest in stabilizing this part of the world. And yes, we're rich. And yes, we want to participate. And yes, we will help, but only if there's a serious progress to a two-state solution. And there is international input, supervision, not just from the West, but also from our part of the world. Now, we're dealing here not with nice little democratic countries in the Middle East, but you have to deal with what you have. And it seems to me that a future for the Palestinians has to be in the cards. And arguing for this is not anti-Semitic. Of course, there's anti-Semitism in the world. But saying something needs to be done for and about the Palestinians, going all the way back to 1917, when they were promised a state, is, I think, a must internationally. It would, if I could just editorialize here, it would help a lot if the United States put its shoulder to the wheel there. And it did so in terms of encouraging multinational supervisory period for Gaza, and was seriously behind a two-state solution, and all the Israelis who agree with that, and at the same time maybe not keep supplying bombs to the Israelis, which of course have been landing on Gaza. Our commitment to the state of Israel is one thing, but if you look at it from the perspective of Palestinians who are saying these bombs that are hitting us, guess where they're coming from? They're coming from the United States. You have to believe that that has a political impact of how we as the United States are seen by Palestinians. And we need to somehow go back on track that we support the state of Israel, but we also support the Palestinians for a two-state solution. Thank you very much for joining today. See you in 2 weeks.